Hey, random stranger! We are closing out Madoka Magica today and all of its tragic ironies, so let's do this. Before we dive into how Homura's love for Madoka essentially became her curse, or like really both of their curses, we should take a moment for Sayaka. I personally was a bit thrown like when we suddenly went back to her story, at least for a little bit, you know, when the news was announcing that her body had been discovered, followed immediately by, and now the weather. It is a small detail, but that whiplash cut pretty deep because it's so painfully realistic. First, it kind of showed how we compartmentalize tragedy and suffering as humans. We have to. We've talked about this before. If we dwelt on every tragedy and injustice unfolding all around us, locally, nationally, globally, at any given moment, we would probably be paralyzed by grief. We would not be able to function. So our brains create these bubbles of normalcy, like, oh my god, that's terrible, this person who got murdered. Also, what's for dinner? Because that is how we stay sane in an insane world. Second, it also demonstrated or reminded us of the truth of how easily magical girls are forgotten. Sayaka's death was this intense, life-altering tragedy for her family, and for Madoka, and obviously for Kyoko. But for everyone else, you know, she's kind of just another missing person who turned up dead, and then life moves on. The weather report came on afterwards because that is what people actually care about. It's something that affects their immediate daily lives. I thought that fed perfectly into how Kyubey and Incubators see humans, and the point that Kyubey made about how humans see livestock. Humans create emotional energy through, you know, their moments of intense suffering, and then they're quickly forgotten and replaced. So to Kyubey, on a large scale, human attachments and grief are so temporary, and our collective ability to move on from tragedy is almost like proof that we were kind of built to be these great energy sources. Kyubey also talked about like the benefits of this perfect symbiotic relationship. So humans raise animals in these safe environments and give them food and shelter in exchange for them eventually becoming meat to sustain the human civilization. Similarly, incubators give magical girls power. They grant their wishes in exchange for becoming a source of energy. And I kind of hate to say it, but I do kind of agree with Kyubey when they said we actually treat humans better than humans treat animals. Unlike livestock, the girls do kind of get to choose whether they become magical girls or not. Although we do have to keep in mind that in certain cases like Mami or Kyoko, they are backed into a corner in these desperate situations so that their choice is barely a choice. Also, Kyubey does withhold important information, obviously. But still, compare that to how animals are treated. You know, they're bred specifically for slaughter, clearly never having consented to that. And due to the huge increase in demand for meat over the last 50 years, a large majority of them are raised in these crowded and unsanitary factory farms. They're pumped full of antibiotics, and then they're processed in often inhumane ways. That's just facts. Like, there are a lot of studies and interviews with abattoir workers who confirm that. Also, while incubators are like mostly honest about the transactional nature of the relationship they have with magical girls, humans, on the other hand, are really good at psychologically distancing ourselves from the reality of how our meat gets produced. And I guess a lot of other products too, like how they end up in our supermarkets or on Amazon, isn't really something that we think about. It's really uncomfortable. Like, I'm uncomfortable thinking about it, and I guess that was the whole point. There's also the fact that incubators are making these utilitarian decisions to preserve life in the whole universe, whereas humans make these decisions for the sake of our own pleasure and convenience. Like, we could survive perfectly fine on plant-based diets, but we choose not to because we like the taste of meat and we need to find ways to mass produce it. Since we're talking about the utilitarian moral framework of the incubators again, I do want to bring in an interesting comment from Adien, who wrote, "A lot of sacrifice for greater good has one very important caveat. People recognize that using this can come back to bite you because you, or those you care about, can also eventually become a sacrifice, thus making pushback against such an act. But those who are outside the choice of a greater good, in this case any non-humans, would be willing to push this choice onto people because they will never be sacrificed." It's an interesting thought. I know we'll probably never get a spin-off or like more information about the alien world of incubators and how they might respond if, say, in a certain universe or a certain timeline, they were the ones being sacrificed for the good of others. Given everything Kyubey has said about emotions being a disease, it would seem that they wouldn't have an issue with being served up, but I guess we'll never really know. But yes, in terms of how so-called utilitarianism has played out practically in human history, that caveat totally rears its head. I think one of the most fascinating things we learned in this episode was when Kyubey revealed to Madoka how this Faustian bargain has been going on all throughout human history. We got glimpses into magical girls who have changed the course of civilization, including this image of a girl leading an army and then being burned at the stake, who was almost certainly meant to evoke Joan of Arc. When Kyubey said it was their wishes that betrayed them, I think they touched on something profound about the nature of desire and of consequence. Magical girls don't wish for small, reasonable things, instead they desire miracles, essentially, like to save their country or to bring life out of death or to change the fundamental nature of reality. So according to the natural laws of this world, balance has to be enacted. You can't make that much good happen without an equivalent amount of suffering to balance it out. So it's not that their wishes were evil or wrong, but that they went so far beyond the natural order of things that reality itself had to compensate, which then links to the most central tragedy of the show, which is that the most heroic and the most selfless wishes carry the heaviest karmic weight and result in the most amount of balancing destruction. That in turn brings us to another uncomfortable question that the show poses to us. Have human living standards really been improved because magical girls willingly sacrificed and suffered? And then more broadly, as a real historical and philosophical inquiry, would we have achieved progress without great suffering? So Kyubey made this huge claim that without the incubators kickstarting the whole magical girl process, humans would still be living in caves. And that is a big statement. Basically, every major advancement in human history, so like agricultural revolutions, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, breakthroughs in medicine and technology, all of that have come about because of girls who wished for the impossible and then paid the price for them. Now, if we look back on history, you could argue that a lot of human leaps forward as a species came during or closely after these intense periods of suffering. For example, war drives technological innovation and social injustice always catalyzes civil rights movements, etc. But it's also equally true that civilizational advances often create new forms of suffering. The Industrial Revolution massively increased general prosperity, but it also created horrible working conditions and, environmental destruction. Modern tech, and the thing that everyone's scared of now, AI, it connects us and has driven these improvements in quality of life and productivity, but it's also led to social isolation and enabled mass surveillance and all the other horrible things that technology brings. So I guess the question isn't just whether suffering is necessary for progress, but whether progress inevitably creates new kinds of suffering. Maybe that cycle of suffering and progress and then more suffering and then more progress is inevitable, which actually adds weight to Kyubey's whole argument. On the other hand, it's also hard to argue counterfactuals. Would we have split the atom and massively ramped up the production of penicillin if it wasn't for World War II? We can't redo history, so we'll never know. But what makes Kyubey's argument so insidious, I think, is that it implies that suffering was necessary for human advancement. And whether that's true or just a convenient justification for exploiting girls, or both, is something that each of us has to decide for ourselves. Moving to something a bit more intimate, it was heartbreaking to see Madoka's mom really struggling with knowing that her daughter is going through something awful, but not being able to help her or to fix it for her. And that is just the most terrifying thing about parenting. A comment from Lupina. One of the most rebuked parts of the story is the mom allowing Madoka to go, but we need to think of the circumstances around them. Junko feels like she is losing her daughter. She pretty much says this to Kazuko, her friend and Madoka's teacher. So she decided that trusting her daughter is the only option she has. But she also knows that they are in a shelter and that there are guards and emergency responders that won't let civilians outside the shelter. She probably thinks that the most Madoka will be able to do is have someone try to contact her friend or locate her at another shelter. There is zero chance she lets Madoka go if there is even a possibility that she can go outside the safety of the shelter. Which is a good point. You know, I did wonder whether if Madoka's mom knew the full extent of what Madoka was planning to do, whether she would have let her go so easily, or not easily, but whether she would have let her go at all. And I agree that she probably wouldn't have. However, like, I'm also kind of surprised that this was even a point of contention, or that people could look at Madoka's mom and be like, oh my God, that's such a bad parent. Because there comes a point in every parent-child relationship where parents have to let their kids make their own choices, even when they're terrified of where those choices might lead them. Madoka's mom tried to tell her that she's not the only person who can or is responsible for saving everyone, which in most circumstances would be true. But in this particular scenario, Madoka really is the one who can stop the Valpurgisnacht, but her mom knows nothing about that. You cannot force someone of this age to do what you want them to do, even as a parent. So your only choice really, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do, is to just trust that you raise them well enough to make the right choices. Speaking of choices, what a choice to have Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam hanging in the bar where Madoka's mum was kind of drinking her worries away. That's not accidental. You know, it depicts a moment when God gives life to humanity. And in the context of this episode, and I guess all of the previous episodes with their very heavy religious symbolism and Madoka being set up as this Christ-like savior figure, I think it suggests that what Madoka is about to do, it's not just a heroic sacrifice. It's also, in a sense, divine intervention. It's foreshadowing the fact that she's about to become something beyond human to save the human race. However, just like Christ embodied both man and God, Madoka also represents both this godlike figure and also humanity. Just as God had to let humanity make their own choices, despite knowing the suffering that it would lead to, because if you give a human the choice between good and evil, there's always a chance that some of us will choose evil. Madoka's mom had to let her daughter make choices that would ultimately lead to her suffering. Again, even if she didn't exactly know that at the time. Let's talk about Homura's fight against the Valpurgisnacht. She comes at it with everything she's got. You know, bombs, missiles, explosive trucks, IEDs, just an entire military arsenal that she's probably pilfered from various crime gangs and governments over several timelines, which is kind of cool. It's definitely enough firepower to level an entire city, but it doesn't even scratch this buffy dress-wearing Valpurgisnacht. Even though Homura is in a bad way by the end of all of this because she's had an entire building block slammed into her. There was also a shot of her time turner thingy showing that it had run out of sand. So she's effectively at the end of the road here, and the only thing that she could do was reset. I wonder if Homura's failure, or like multiple failures, wasn't an apt metaphor for the futility of trying to solve deep emotional or spiritual problems with material solutions. The Valpurgisnacht is a conglomeration of witches. So it's this intensely concentrated manifestation of despair itself. And just like you cannot cure despair with more money or like any sort of material good, you probably cannot destroy the Valpurgisnacht with conventional weapons. It needs to be taken down by some sort of cosmic force like magic, which seems to stand in as a symbol for selfless, sacrificial, godly love. Homura's very powerful but ultimately useless weapons feel like a representation of humanity's limitations. And that links back neatly to the religious symbolism that's been building throughout the show. Just like Jesus, you know, God's representative on earth, was the only one who could save humans from themselves, Madoka is the only one with the accumulated karmic power and selfless love needed to undergo the kind of divine transformation that will then allow her to defeat the Valpurgisnacht. Man, you do have to feel for Homura though. She has no choice but to keep hoping and to keep trying, because otherwise she'd have to accept that everything she's done has been completely pointless. And then that would of course lead to being crushed by the despair of that thought. That touches on some spicy philosophical territory. So remember Schopenhauer, you know, famous for his life as a big pendulum theory. He saw hope as, in essence, a form of suffering. We suffer when we hope for what we want but don't have, and then we suffer more when we're afraid of losing what we do have. Hope just prolongs the agony of insatiable desires that humans have by keeping us attached to outcomes that we cannot control. On the other hand, surrealists, so proponents of the philosophy underpinning the Witch's Labyrinth, which explores reality through dreamlike and very irrational imagery, they saw hope as a kind of beautiful delusion that is necessary to survive in this crazy, depressing world. In other words, hope is fundamentally a form of madness, but it is a madness that allows us to keep functioning in these impossible situations. I think Homura embodies both those perspectives. Her hope that she can defeat the Walpurgisnacht by herself is a delusion, that just prolongs her suffering and also kind of Madoka's suffering. But it has also been the only thing keeping her from totally succumbing to complete psychological meltdown. Something I've thought about a lot since the last episode, and also something that I threw to you guys, was what Homura meant when she told Madoka the more that she repeats all of this, the further in time they drift away from each other. I think in one sense, Homura is describing the way that repeated exposure to trauma changes you and naturally distances you from both the person you used to be and also from the people who haven't shared your experiences. Every time Homura resets time, she carries with her the memories of Madoka's multiple deaths and of all of her failings in countless different ways. Whereas Madoka resets, she doesn't remember any of that. She does not experience the weight of all of the trauma Homura has been through. So it's only natural that Homura would become increasingly isolated by the accumulation of all of the experiences that only she remembers and Madoka doesn't. There's also another tragic aspect that Tyler Rock covered really well. So they wrote, a big part of what Homura means when she says they drift apart is that each time Homura resets the timeline, she spends less and less time on her friendship and connection with Madoka and more time seeking out solutions to keep her safe. In the current timeline, Homura spends all her time killing witches and hardly interacts with Madoka outside of warning her or scolding her. Not only that, but to Madoka, a lot of the time they spent together was Homura speaking to her in a cold, calculated, and very cryptic fashion. Also like shooting Cube full of holes with no explanation. Madoka doesn't know Homura because Homura cannot waste any time going through the motions of re-meeting her when she needs to dedicate all of her time to ensuring her happiness. I thought that was a great explanation of how basically every time Homura resets, it strips away more and more of her human emotions and her capacity to connect with other people. Like the first time she saw Madoka die, obviously and understandably, she was devastated and heartbroken and just overcome with grief. But after 100 loops, she is eerily calm about witnessing all this death and all this tragedy. She has become like this machine that is programmed to methodically calculate the most efficient route to saving Madoka. When she interacts with Sayaka or Kyoko or Mami, she doesn't see them as people anymore. They are just variables in a very complex equation that she's trying to solve. What about how she treats Madoka though? Because she does show a lot of intense emotion when faced with Madoka. I think on one level, Homura still does love Madoka, but it does feel though that her love has become so abstracted from the actual person of Madoka that you could argue it's not really love in a genuine sense anymore. What does it mean to love someone? Like it involves seeing and accepting the other person as they truly are. It's respecting their agency and their wishes, even if it conflicts with what you want. And even though Homura started out wanting to fulfill Madoka's wish of never becoming a witch, it's like the real Madoka, the one who wants to help others, who wants to make her own moral choice to sacrifice herself. That Madoka has become almost irrelevant to Homura's goal. In fact, I would say that Homura no longer loves Madoka as she really exists anymore in any given timeline. She is stuck on the now distant, idealized, non-existent version of Madoka from the first timeline. And I think that's why Homura says things like she feels like she's drifting further away from Madoka and how they're not even in the same time. Over time, her love has hardened into this mechanical obsession, in the same way that a software program executes a command until it completes a given task. That is not the same as the kind of genuine care and connection and flexibility that characterizes real love. Would everything have turned out better if Homura had just let Madoka die in the very first timeline? The sad answer is likely yes. In the original timeline, Madoka would have died as a regular magical girl. I'm not sure if in that timeline she defeated the Walpurgis Nacht. I think she did. Assuming that she did, the world would have been saved without Madoka becoming the world's greatest witch, in the same way that Kyoko died taking Sayaka with her. Instead, Homura's inability to accept that created the situation now where Madoka has so many strings of fate tied to her that her transformation into a witch will literally end the world. It is Greek tragedy at its finest. The hero's greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness, and their attempts to avoid their fate only results in it coming to pass in the worst possible way. And that's why I think Madoka Magica earned its reputation as a masterpiece. It executes that millennia-old tradition of tragedy so well by showing us how even the most basic universal human virtues of love and of the desire to protect and help others can destroy everything when taken to their logical extremes. I thought before we start episode 12, Homura has to restrain herself from resetting time again, right? As Madoka takes out the Walpurgis Nacht. So I don't know if we're going to get a resolved ending or if it's just going to be one of those, and here we go again. All right, here we go in 3, 2, 1, play. It's interesting that it's about what she's done, which I get. But yeah, she's definitely lost focus on what Madoka wants. Ugh. That I'm the kind of person who would become the greatest witch ever is kind of your fault, is what she's saying, but in a very, very nice way. Mm. Mm. Wait, so what happens to the power sources then? Well, for the first time, Kyubei's eyes actually show some emotion. What does this reset everything? No. Who? Yeah, okay. So they have talked about this. Wait, she's becoming a first order principal. Damn. I mean, Schopenhauer probably doesn't exist after this. It's a very sad clarinet. It's interesting that these girls are super supportive of Madoka's wish to essentially destroy herself so that no one else has to suffer. Whereas Homura is not having it. God, Madoka. It kind of reminds me of Galinda. Oh, that's. Oh, yeah, that's a Volpurgisnacht? No. Oh, it's just a magical girl at some point in time. Where does that all go, though? Like, does Madoka breathe it in, take it on herself? I mean, that would kind of fit with the whole Christ imagery. Madoka is the Jesus. These are girls from way in the past. Like their outfits and stuff. Viking girl. Just going down in style, laughing manically. I mean, Homura will also just like, is she making them disappear as people? No, because Homura's still here. This is like the point of the birth of the new universe. Madoka was the Big Bang. Oh shit. Well, that's it. Like, did she didn't remake time. She had to destroy everything before she could make a new one, like a new universe come into existence. Oh, did she find a loophole? The loophole of all loopholes. Like destroying the concept of despair itself? I mean, that is what Mummy said too. What is happening? Okay, because she's transcended time and everything, so she sees everything. I mean, I'm happy with this. This is very gay, so it's all worth it. This is a great version of like the power of love trope, you know? Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Ah, here we go. The red string of fate. I mean, the pink string, same thing. You just have to believe because I am the Jesus. Oh, look at all those civils floating around everywhere. I'm just waiting for the punchline. I'm waiting for the moment where we're like, oh shit, Madoka didn't fix everything. Okay. It's a deep significance to that. Mm. Okay, so that's the angle. It's not pointless even though I'm going to erase it. Is Madoka giving Sayaka a last chance to see Kyosuke play one last time before everything disappears? Oh, Kyoko. Okay, so they disappear now instead of turning into witches, which makes sense because Madoka erased all witches. Dare? That's okay, so basically, instead of okay. Because Madoka's absorbing all of the bad puka puka. But surely that will lead to something even worse down the track, right? Oh, so sad. Oh my god. Oh no! I thought it might have been because she died, but no, she doesn't even exist. Oh my god. Damn, that hit hard. The self reference is amazing. Man, this is just a whole different kind of sad. Hmm. What is she feeding him? I love that even Cubase like has had their memories erased. They fight wraiths now. So I guess they gather it from the wraiths. Huh. Oh, she's taken Madoka's weapon. Wait. So Homura has magical powers now. She's not just using like the, missiles and her bombs and her conventional weapons. I also love that they again put this opening song at the end because it's kind of like the beginning is the end, but is also another beginning kind of thing. That last line Homura said about how, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this is still the same shitty world, and that the despair and the suffering have just shifted forms. So it's no longer magical girls who suffer everlasting torment and collapse into grief seeds, but then that only leads to the question, so who is suffering and taking on the form of these wraiths? Because essentially the wraiths are the new magical girls, right? Or how do these wraiths come into being in the first place? And when I was looking at them, I was like, man, they kind of look like older people, like adults who are just bent over with sorrow, or more likely bent over with this unending cycle of the 9 to 5 and ever decreasing purchasing power because of inflation. I don't know. I was looking at them and I was like, man, they definitely look older and so much more jaded. So I don't know. Oh, what? Uh, oh, ah, what is that? What is she? So I had a bit of time to think about things, and my mind is so full of all of the new possibilities and consequences that could spin out of Madoka's wish, and also Homura turning into whatever she was there in that post-credit scene. But let's just rewind and take the time to process more where the series left us. One, to appreciate how tight all 12 episodes were. I don't think there was any filler in it, at least not to me. And two, to entertain ourselves by working out all of the potential implications of this new universe that God/Jesus Madoka created, and the wild card that still clearly exists, namely Homura. Let's start with the big one. So Madoka pushed the big red button and took the nuclear option by wishing to erase all witches from every timeline, past, present, and future. I reckon the thing that made us most feel the full weight of that choice was Kyubey making their shocked Pikachu face for the first time and only time ever. The thing that kind of shocked me was that Madoka, to my understanding and what we kind of saw on screen after she made the wish, was that she essentially committed genocide on a cosmic scale. You know, she, or rather that thing that she turned into or was born as a result of her bearing all of the despair of all the magical girls in all time, wiped out the existing universe first and then created the new one. If that's actually what happened, the moral considerations get pretty dicey, I think. Also, yes, Madoka saves magical girls from becoming witches, but she did it by playing God. You know, she made this unilateral decision that fundamentally changed the billions of humans living their lives in the original timeline. I mean, essentially they were wiped out and then recreated again. They all ceased to exist and then were replaced by alternate versions of themselves, I guess, who have never lived through certain experiences. The saddest example is how Madoka's own family doesn't remember her because there is nothing to remember. There was a residue of her in the sense that her baby brother somehow has her as his imaginary friend, but that's about it. I know that in the original timeline, the alternative wasn't so hot either, like everyone dies because of the Walpurgisnacht, but I still feel that we should pause and consider that maybe some people would have preferred that outcome, you know, prefer to die, but having lived through certain experiences and loved certain people, rather than live as rewritten versions of themselves who never knew what they lost. The example where that went the other way was the fact that Sayaka could have been alive again, but only if Madoka erased the future where Kyosuke is healed and plays violin. So for Sayaka's sake, Madoka, again, chose for her to keep that future, meaning Sayaka faded away, but she was fine with it because that just so happened to align with what she really wanted. On the other hand, I feel like it didn't really matter what Madoka would have done. Sayaka was always going to, in every single universe, sacrifice herself for Kyosuke. The fact that in the new universe, she dies also at a train station and the chessboard is back. That ever-present sign that fate is going to fate. Interestingly, the detail of Kyosuke playing Ave Maria was perfect here. You know, it's a piece that honors the mother of Christ, so Mary, someone who also watched her child sacrifice themselves for others, which raises a depressing question about Madoka's own mother. Would she have preferred to stay in the reality where Madoka was her daughter, you know, even if that meant living and dying with the consequences of that world, rather than living in this new world where Madoka never existed at all? At least in the original timeline, she had 14 years of loving her daughter. You know, in the new reality, not that she knows it, I know, but still, she has nothing, you know, no memories and no grief even, because there is nothing to grieve. I honestly am torn about what the right thing to do would have been. I think that's kind of just a futile exercise because I don't think there is any right thing. That's also not really the key question. It's more recognizing that although Madoka's choice was the ultimate expression of her compassion for people, it was also unavoidably authoritarian. In practice, Madoka decided that her version of a better world was worth ending an entire universe. There was no consultation about it, obviously, because that was impossible. And so she became the ultimate utilitarian, so determined to save people and to spare magical girls their pain that she was willing to deny everyone the choice of whether that pain might be worth it to them. She created this universe in which everyone except Homura is unaware that their entire existence is built on the erasure of a previous reality where a different version of themselves loved and lost in different ways. And I just feel like that is a key sticking point, regardless of whether this new universe that Madoka has created is better or not. There's a strong parallel between what Madoka did and what Homura did. Homura did all of these things out of a love for Madoka, but never did she ask what Madoka would have wanted. It was more, what does she think herself is worth fighting for and worth sacrificing for? Something we've been talking about a lot, especially in the last couple of episodes, was the Madoka Jesus. I think Madoka's wish made her transformation into a Jesus figure complete. In Christian theology, Christ's crucifixion and subsequent resurrection destroyed the old covenant of law and established a new covenant of grace. And Madoka did that too, literally. No, she destroyed the existing magical girl system and created these new universal laws. Both Jesus and Madoka embodied God, but in doing so also became really isolated. Both had to accept infinite suffering. Christ took on all of the sin of every human being ever born, while Madoka God had to bear all magical girls' despair forever to stop witches from being born. She became the universal sin bearer, and like Christ, no one forced that choice upon her, but it was also the only choice that could have saved everyone. Another way that Madoka's wish reflects Jesus is that in both cases, sin or suffering wasn't completely eliminated from the world. They did, however, create a way for people to be redeemed. Madoka's sacrifice did result in a more merciful system where magical girls can just die with honor and disappear instead of drowning in despair and becoming witches. It is also much better in the sense that girls are actually told beforehand what happens to them if they deplete their power in a fight. However, we do have to go back to the fact that Madoka's solution was specific and not perfect. She solved the problem that mattered most to her, magical girls turning into witches out of despair. But she did not or was not able to create a paradise. The world is still broken, people are still suffering, and I believe the fundamental problem of entropy still exists. On top of that, as we saw, new problems have emerged. So we have raids now. Maybe that is better in the sense that despair is more contained and not so easily spread through raids. I'm not really sure. But I did like the fact that the series did not end on a perfect note. I'll elaborate on my theory about where raids come from. I think they're adults who have had enough of this world. Cube said that gathering despair via magical girls turning into witches would have been a more relatively efficient process, implying that raids are less efficient energy sources. And that might be, in my guess, because adults generally have better emotional regulation and tools to process despair and depression than teenagers. Therefore, less emotional volatility equals less energy efficiency. Notice how pixelated they were as well, especially around the eye area, which, I don't know, might represent the depression that is characteristic of our modern digitized world. The disconnect and the way that technology gave rise to these unprecedented forms of alienation and loneliness. There is another potential problem of this new universe that crossed my mind. So this new system is called the Way of the Cycle, which I guess is the form that Madoka took when she became the fundamental law that governs how magical girls disappear when they die. But what happens to a concept, or I guess she's still kind of a being that has to bear infinite suffering? Madoka said that she will be everywhere throughout all of space and time, absorbing the despair of every magical girl whoever was or ever will be. Even if she is no longer a person and is a quote-unquote concept, can her new form still feel loneliness? Can hope itself eventually break under the weight of eternal despair? I know in some sense it's kind of a silly question. Concepts don't have feelings and therefore it's moot. But still, there's a weird kind of seed of a doubt as to how sustainable this new system is, and I think there could be some interesting ways that could develop as a potential new problem. The final thing I'd say about Madoka's overall character arc from start to finish is how amazingly it subverted the typical hero's journey by leaving the actual heroic decision to be made in the very last second. In most narratives, the hero gets their call early and then they spend the bulk of the story growing in their confidence and in their power. But Madoka spent 11 and a half episodes being told how much potential she has while actively refusing to pursue it. She was a protagonist who didn't want to be the protagonist. Even while the other girls were living out their hero stories with all of the attendant tragic consequences, Madoka stayed on the sidelines for 98% of the series. That delay became a critical part of the story and a huge part of of why I think it's such a success. By the time Madoka finally decides to save the universe, we've seen every possible consequence play out across multiple timelines. Even as every time Homura reset the time, it added to the weight of Madoka's ultimate fate. So Madoka's wish to erase all witches across all timelines felt both like, wow, okay, this is a crazy solution that might actually work and is probably the only solution to this particular problem. And it also felt inevitable because she was the only character who really thought about the system long enough to realize that the problem lies in the system itself. And because of Homura, she was also the only character who was powerful enough at this point to actually be able to carry it out. In conclusion, it was an amazing writing choice to leave Madoka's choice to this last episode. Let's talk about Homura. First of all, I think it's an absolute tragedy that she's the only person in this universe who remembers what things were like in the old universe. Imagine carrying that kind of knowledge, knowing that the love of your life sacrificed herself to save everyone and continues to sacrifice herself every day, and no one else even knows that she ever existed or exists. I'm not sure if Homura was able to retain her memories of Madoka the person because of how connected she was to Madoka through all of those strings of fate, or whether it had something to do with the fact that she was with Madoka in that in-between space after Madoka made a wish, but before she became a full-on concept. Madoka did also give her that pink ribbon, and I don't know if that then became a thing that tied Homura physically to Madoka the person, even in the rewritten universe. And maybe that was the real miracle, you know, the fact that someone still remembered Madoka the person. And only now do I realize how many times I have said Madoka the person. But then that makes me wonder if there isn't some kind of duality happening where Madoka the person might still exist, but submerged within Madoka the universal law or concept. I think that might be a possibility only because they left the thread of Homura's connection to Madoka the person. And because this story does continue, I think that's going to be the next challenge for Homura, you know, getting back her own personal Madoka. Homura changed in an interesting way in the new universe, and it seems that she has inherited some of Madoka's power. She was using Madoka's magical bow and arrow as her weapon instead of her, you know, original time manipulation and conventional weapons. Again, I don't know if that's because she was there with Madoka in that in-between space. What hasn't changed, though, is her love for Madoka. You know, the love that became tainted over countless time resets to the point of Homura being unwilling to honor Madoka's choice to sacrifice herself. I think Homura's original wish is going to come into play. Her wish was to be the one protecting Madoka instead of the other way around. It wasn't preventing Madoka from becoming a witch, even though that was part of what motivated her to reset time. Now Madoka has to protect all magical girls in all timelines forever, including Homura. So really, Homura's original wish remains unfulfilled. And Homura has never been one to accept an outcome that she doesn't like when it comes to Madoka. And it didn't seem like she really agreed with Madoka's latest life choice to become the law that absorbs everyone else's despair. So I think her commitment to keep fighting is more ominous than it seems. The post-credits scene also seemed to support that reading. Homura's wings, instead of like the flashy purple magical girl color, had turned black and looked corrupted by the post-credit scene, with the star resembling a witch's labyrinth. Witches supposedly don't exist in this universe, but there's Homura spreading those wings. There were those lines that I guess reflect Homura's psychological state. It read, "Don't forget, always somewhere someone is fighting for you. As long as you remember her, you are not alone," which on the surface sounds nice and comforting. You know, it's a reminder that Madoka's always watching over magical girls and therefore Homura. But in Homura's context, it does take on a kind of unhealthy connotation. It suggests that she's still clinging to the idea that Madoka is with her, still personally supporting her decisions, when really Madoka chose to become something that's beyond the personal. And I'm guessing the voice that was telling Homura to, you know, keep it up wasn't actually Madoka. It was Homura's idealized version of Madoka that she's been building up in her head for a long, long time and has probably dug her heels into because she is the only one, again, that remembers Madoka the person. Not only has she not let go of Madoka, but I think she's going to redouble her efforts to find a way to get her Madoka back. Sure, she's fighting raids, but I think that's more of a side quest for Homura. I think what she's really fighting for is the day that Madoka is fully protected, meaning Homura is going to have to find a way to break even this universe that Madoka has created, and she seems to finally have gained the magical power to do that. I'm not 100% sure what was happening exactly in this moment, but it did look like Homura was trying to break free or break the threads of fate that tie Madoka to the choice that she made. And if anyone can figure out how to break the laws of a universe, aside from Madoka, it's probably the girl who is still connected to her and already has the impressive achievement of breaking time itself on her resume. I listened to the OP again in full, this time concentrating more on the lyrics now that we have the full story. I love this OP, and on first listen, Connect sounds like it reflects typical teenage magical girl optimism. It's very upbeat, it's energetic, it's full of lyrics about, reaching out and connecting with others. But in retrospect, it's an incredibly ironic song. The magical girl system that Madoka dismantled actually disconnects each magical girl from her normal life, from her family and her friends, and ultimately from their own humanity when they eventually turn into witches. Unless you're a badass like Kyoko and kind of self-destruct before that can happen to you. The song talks about the power of friendship and of shared dreams and hope, and meanwhile, the actual show demonstrates how the pursuit of heroism leads to isolation and disappointment and then despair. Even Madoka's ultimate act of sacrifice or of connection, saving all the magical girls, requires her to disconnect from every personal relationship that she's ever had, including her closest one with her family. So all of those lyrics and the way that the chorus lifts up with some major chords takes on sinister undertones once you know that wishes in this universe come at a very steep cost. It's a happy sounding beware what you wish for kind of song. I think that disconnect between the song's optimism and the series' darker reality relates then also to the show's broader theme about that gap between heroic ideals and their more realistic, brutal consequences. And of course, you guys already know the genius in the way that they did the key changes to put in mind the fact that underneath all of that was this time loop / time reset reveal. Now, Magia, the ED, I think is a song that is more upfront about the reality that Madoka Magica deals with. Unlike the brightness of Connect, Magia deals with darker magical themes that hint at this twisted nature of magical girl contracts. It mentions the ancient power of magic as something potentially dangerous and not necessarily empowering. The sound, and I think it's a steady pacing of the song, and also the visuals, of course, of Madoka running towards her ultimate fate, convey this sense of inevitability, this feeling of being caught up in forces that are beyond your control and dictating where you're going, which is what it's like to be a magical girl. You make one wish thinking that you're doing something great and good, and then you discover that you've just set a whole cycle of suffering in motion that will ultimately consume you. My favorite line in this song was, "In my hand is the courage of a hand-picked flower." That really got me. I think it's a beautiful line and also beautifully tragic. A picked flower is beautiful, yes, but it's also doomed. The moment you pick it, you've killed it, even if what you think you're doing is something beautiful. And again, that's exactly what happens to magical girls. Their courage is real and it's pure, and they do get their wishes granted, but all of that is also thrust into this cosmic horror situation that ultimately, one way or another, destroys them and turns them into monsters. For Madoka, I think that line foreshadows the final moment when she finally found the courage to make her wish. She had been gathering that courage through 11 episodes, of watching everything go wrong around her. But once she took that step, once she plucked that flower, she removed herself from natural existence forever, acting on her courage of finally taking the step to choose to save the universe destroyed her as a person. Thank you all so much for watching Madoka Magica with me. Thank you for your comments. That added so much to my understanding of the show and to all of the potential readings of it. Thank you just for being great watch buddies. You know, I couldn't wish for better, and it's good that I don't have to wish for anything because we know what happens when you do. I look forward to watching the movies, which if you want to access right away as soon as they happen, you can if you sign up as a member on my Coffee page. Coffee really helps me keep making analytical content like this, or you can just wait until it's eventually out on the main channel. Take care, guys. It has been a blast, and there will be new animes that we're going to start watching soon.